The bitter wind howled like a wounded animal as Cassandra Evans stumbled through knee-deep snow, her fingers numb and her hope fading with each labored step. The stagecoach that had abandoned her 3 miles back was now just a distant memory, its driver and fellow passengers having left her behind after the wheel broke and arguments erupted about who would stay with the luggage. Being the youngest and a woman traveling alone, they had somehow decided she would be the one to wait while they sought help that she now realized would never come as the blizzard intensified. Colorado territory in 1869 was unforgiving, especially to a 22-year-old schoolteacher from Boston who had traveled west with dreams of independence and adventure. Those dreams now seemed foolish as she fought to remain conscious, her wool coat providing little protection against the relentless December storm. "Just keep moving," Cassandra whispered to herself, her voice immediately swept away by the wind. "Keep moving or you'll die out here." Her trunk of belongings, her letters of introduction to the school board in Silver Creek, even her prized books all left behind in the stagecoach. None of it mattered now. Survival was her only concern as darkness began to fall and the temperature plummeted further. The world around her had become a white void, disorienting and endless. Cassandra could no longer feel her feet, and her steps became increasingly erratic. When she fell for the 3rd time, the effort to stand again seemed insurmountable. Perhaps, she thought, she could rest for just a moment. Just long enough to gather her strength. As her eyelids grew heavy, a sound penetrated the howling wind, the rhythmic pounding of hooves against packed snow. Cassandra forced her eyes open, squinting through the whiteout conditions to see a dark shape materializing through the veil of snow. A horse, a rider. Summoning what little energy remained, she raised a trembling arm and called out, her voice barely audible even to her own ears. But somehow, miraculously, the rider turned in her direction. As the figure drew closer, Cassandra made out the broad shoulders of a man, his face partially obscured by a bandana pulled up against the cold, a wide-brimmed hat dusted with snow pulled low over his eyes. He reined his horse to a stop beside her, and for a moment, they simply stared at one another, she from the ground, he from atop his massive chestnut stallion. "Madam," he called over the wind, his voice deep and rough, "you're half frozen. What in God's name are you doing out here alone?" "Stage. Broke down," she managed through chattering teeth. "They left me. To wait." A string of curses flew from the man's mouth before he dismounted in one fluid motion. Up close, Cassandra could see piercing blue eyes above the bandana, the only color in the white landscape. "Those bastards left you? In this?" He shook his head in disgust, then knelt beside her. "Can you stand?" Cassandra tried but found her legs unwilling to cooperate. Without hesitation, the stranger scooped her up as if she weighed nothing, his strong arms secure around her shivering form. He carried her to his horse and somehow managed to mount while still holding her. "I'm taking you to shelter," he said, settling her in front of him on the saddle. He wrapped one arm firmly around her waist while the other held the reins. "My cabin's about 4 miles from here. Hold on tight." As the horse began to move, Cassandra felt the man's warmth behind her, solid and reassuring. She leaned back against his chest, no longer concerned with propriety or the fact that she was pressed intimately against a complete stranger. All that mattered was the promise of shelter and the strong, steady heartbeat she could feel against her back. "I'm Levi," the man said, his mouth close to her ear so she could hear him over the storm. "Levi Daniels." "Cassandra Evans," she replied weakly. "Thank you for saving my life, Mr. Daniels." "Don't thank me yet, Miss Evans. We've still got to make it through this blizzard." The journey seemed both endless and brief, time distorted by Cassandra's semi-conscious state. She drifted in and out of awareness, sometimes startled back to consciousness by Levi's voice urging her to stay awake. other times by the jostling of the horse as it navigated difficult terrain. "Stay with me," he kept saying, his voice a lifeline in the white abyss. "Just a little further now." When they finally arrived at the cabin, Cassandra was barely conscious. She was vaguely aware of being carried across a threshold, of sudden stillness after the constant motion of riding, of blessed warmth as Levi laid her down near a fireplace. "Miss Evans? Cassandra?" His voice sounded concerned as he gently patted her cheek. "I need you to stay awake while I get this fire going." She forced her eyes open to find him kneeling beside her, his bandana now removed to reveal a strong jaw covered in several days' growth of beard. He couldn't have been more than 30, with lines at the corners of his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting against the sun. "I'm trying," she whispered. The cabin was small but well built, a single room with a stone fireplace, a narrow bed in one corner, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, and shelves stocked with supplies. It was the home of a man who lived alone and valued practicality over comfort. Levi moved quickly, coaxing the banked embers in the fireplace back to life, adding kindling and logs until flames licked hungrily at the wood. He then turned his attention back to Cassandra, his expression grave as he assessed her condition. "Your clothes are soaked through. You need to get out of them." Under normal circumstances, Cassandra would have been scandalized by such a suggestion, but as feeling painfully returned to her extremities, she understood the necessity. Still, she hesitated. Understanding flashed in Levi's eyes. "I'll turn my back," he said. "There's a blanket here, and I've got some clothes that might fit you well enough for now." He placed a woolen blanket and what appeared to be a flannel shirt and pair of trousers beside her. "Can you manage on your own?" Cassandra nodded, though she wasn't entirely certain. As Levi turned away to tend to his horse outside, she struggled with the buttons of her coat, her fingers clumsy and painful as circulation returned. It took tremendous effort, but she eventually managed to remove her wet garments and pull on Levi's shirt, which hung past her knees. The trousers were impossibly large, so she wrapped the blanket around her lower half instead, creating a makeshift skirt. When Levi returned, stomping snow from his boots, he looked relieved to see her changed and sitting closer to the fire. "Better?" he asked, hanging his coat on a peg by the door. "Much, thank you." He nodded, then busied himself with preparing something at the small stove in the corner. "You need something hot inside you. Coffee's brewing, and I'm making a stew with yesterday's rabbit." As warmth slowly returned to her body, Cassandra became more aware of her surroundings and of the impropriety of her situation. Here she was, alone in a cabin with a man she had just met, wearing his clothing, with night falling fast and a blizzard raging outside. Her reputation would be in tatters if anyone ever found out. Yet what choice did she have? This man had saved her life. "Mr. Daniels," she began, "I cannot express my gratitude adequately if you hadn't come along when you did." "Don't mention it," he replied, his back to her as he stirred the pot on the stove. "Couldn't leave you out there. No decent man would. Nevertheless, I am forever in your debt." He turned then, fixing her with those intense blue eyes. "You from back east?" he asked, clearly changing the subject. "Yes, Boston. I was on my way to Silver Creek to take a position as the schoolteacher there." Something flickered across his face, surprise, perhaps, or recognition. "Silver Creek, you say? That's my hometown, or it was. Haven't been back in 5 years. You live out here alone? So far from town?" Levi shrugged, pouring coffee into a tin cup and bringing it to her. "I prefer it this way. People can be complicated." His fingers brushed hers as he handed her the cup, and Cassandra felt an unexpected warmth that had nothing to do with the fire or the hot beverage. There was something about this quiet, solitary man that intrigued her something beyond gratitude for her rescue. "Careful, it's hot," he warned. The coffee was strong and bitter, but it warmed her from the inside out. As she sipped, Levi returned to the stew, adding pinches of dried herbs from jars on a shelf. "You cook," she observed. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "Man's got to eat." "Of course, I just meant. You seem quite capable. 5 years alone in these mountains will teach a man to be capable. Or he doesn't last the first winter." There was a story there, Cassandra sensed. What would drive a man to isolate himself so completely? What had happened 5 years ago in Silver Creek? But before she could frame a polite way to ask, Levi spoke again. "This storm's not letting up anytime soon. You'll have to stay here tonight, maybe longer." The implications hung between them, unspoken but undeniable. Cassandra nodded slowly. "I understand. And I appreciate your hospitality. There's just the one bed," Levi continued, gesturing to the narrow cot in the corner. "You'll take it. I'll sleep by the fire. I couldn't possibly displace you from your own bed." "You're not displacing me. I'm offering." His tone brooked no argument. "Besides, you're still recovering from the cold. You need proper rest." Cassandra wanted to protest further, but found herself oddly touched by his insistence. This gruff, solitary man was showing her a gentleness she hadn't expected. They ate the rabbit stew in relative silence, sitting on opposite sides of the small table. The food was surprisingly good, simple but flavorful, with wild onions and herbs. As Cassandra's strength returned, so did her curiosity about her rescuer. "May I ask what brings you out in such weather, Mr. Daniels? It seems providential that you were passing by when you were." Levi took his time answering, as if weighing how much to share. "I trap in these parts. Had to check my lines before the worst of the storm hit." He paused, then added, "And it's just Levi. Mr. Daniels was my father." "Then you must call me Cassandra." He nodded, though she noticed he avoided saying her name aloud, as if the intimacy of it made him uncomfortable. As night deepened outside, the wind continued to howl around the cabin's sturdy walls. Levi built up the fire, ensuring the small space would remain warm through the night. He then made a pallet for himself on the floor nearby, using a bedroll and extra blankets. "You should rest," he told Cassandra. "Morning will come soon enough, and we'll figure out what to do then." Though exhaustion pulled at her, Cassandra found it difficult to settle. The day's events kept replaying in her mind: the broken stagecoach, the callous abandonment by her fellow travelers, the terrifying hours alone in the blizzard, and finally, her rescue by this enigmatic mountain man. She lay on the narrow bed, listening to Levi's steady breathing from his place by the fire. What kind of man retreated from civilization to live alone in the wilderness? And yet, he had not hesitated to help her, a stranger. There was kindness beneath his rough exterior. "Levi?" she whispered, uncertain if he was still awake. Came the immediate response. "Why did you leave Silver Creek?" The silence stretched so long that Cassandra thought he might not answer. Finally, his voice came, low and measured. "Some places hold too many ghosts." The simple statement contained volumes of unspoken pain. Cassandra wanted to ask more, but sensed it would be unwelcome. Instead, she said, "I'm sorry. Don't be. It was a long time ago." But 5 years wasn't really such a long time, Cassandra thought. Not for some wounds. "Thank you again," she said softly, "for everything." In the firelight, she saw him nod once before turning on his side, effectively ending the conversation. Morning brought no reprieve from the storm. If anything, the blizzard had intensified overnight, with snow piling high against the cabin walls and wind finding every tiny crack to whistle through. Levi rose early and rekindled the fire before Cassandra awoke. She found him at the window, peering out at the white wasteland beyond. "Good morning," she said, pulling the blanket more tightly around her shoulders as she joined him. "Morning." He glanced at her, then quickly away. "Storm's worse. We're not going anywhere today." Cassandra tried to hide her dismay. Another day alone with this stranger, another day of impropriety that could ruin her chances of being accepted as Silver Creek schoolteacher. And yet, a small, traitorous part of her wasn't entirely displeased by the delay. "I see," she said simply. "Well, I shall try not to impose on your hospitality any longer than necessary." Something like amusement flickered in Levi's eyes. "Not much choice for either of us, is there?" The day stretched before them, confined as they were to the small cabin. After a breakfast of cornmeal mush sweetened with a precious spoonful of honey, Levi set about various tasks: mending a trap, whittling a new handle for a tool, checking his supplies. Cassandra, feeling useless and restless, finally asked if there was anything she could do to help. Levi appeared surprised by the offer. "You don't have to earn your keep. I'd prefer to be useful." He considered this, then nodded toward a basket in the corner. "Those socks have holes. If you know how to darn." "I do." Cassandra was grateful for the task, something familiar in this strange situation. They worked in companionable silence for a time, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the howling wind outside. Occasionally, Levi would get up to add more wood to the fire or to check the condition of the storm through the window, but otherwise, they remained absorbed in their respective tasks. It was during one of these quiet moments that Cassandra noticed a small shelf of books near the bed, perhaps a dozen volumes, well worn but carefully arranged. She was surprised. Somehow, she hadn't pictured this solitary trapper as a reader. "You enjoy books?" she said, nodding toward the shelf. Levi followed her gaze, and something in his expression softened. "They're good company on long winter nights." Cassandra rose and went to examine the titles. There were several practical guides, one on wilderness survival, another on medicinal plants, but also works of literature. Thoreau's Walden, a volume of Shakespeare's sonnets, The Last of the Mohicans, and, surprisingly, a collection of Elizabeth Barrett Browning's poetry. "You have eclectic tastes," she observed, carefully taking down the Browning. "My wife's," Levi said quietly. The simple statement hung in the air between them. Cassandra turned to him, startled. "Your wife? She's gone." His voice was flat, emotionless. 5 years now, and there it was, the ghost that had driven him from Silver Creek, the pain he carried into these mountains. "I'm so sorry," Cassandra said, carefully replacing the book. "I didn't mean to pry." Levi shrugged, but the tension in his shoulders betrayed his discomfort. "You didn't know, was it? Illness?" she asked cautiously. "Childbirth." The words seemed torn from him. "Her and our son both." Cassandra's heart ached for this man who had lost everything in a single, devastating moment. What must it have been like for him to lose both his wife and child? To have his future, his family, his hopes all extinguished at once? "There are no words adequate for such a loss," she said softly. Levi nodded once, acknowledging her sentiment without meeting her eyes. Then, as if regretting his openness, he stood abruptly. "Need to check on the horse." He pulled on his coat and hat and disappeared outside into the blizzard, leaving Cassandra alone with the knowledge of his tragedy. She returned to her darning, but her mind was filled with thoughts of Levi Daniels and the life he had lost. When he returned sometime later, snow crusted on his coat and beard, there was a guardedness about him that hadn't been there before. They ate a simple lunch of hardtack and jerky in silence, the earlier ease between them now strained by the weight of his revelation. As the day wore on, however, necessity forced them to interact. The cabin needed tending, Meals needed preparing, and the close quarters made prolonged silence awkward. Gradually, they found their way back to conversation, careful to avoid anything too personal. Cassandra told him about Boston, about her decision to come west after her parents' deaths left her with no family ties to hold her back. Levi, in turn, shared stories of the mountains, the changing seasons, the wildlife, the challenges and rewards of a solitary existence. By evening, a tentative comfort had been re-established between them. As they sat before the fire after supper, Levi surprised her by asking, "Would you read something? From the Browning, maybe?" Cassandra looked up from her mending, touched by the request. Of course. She fetched the volume and settled back in her chair, selecting a sonnet at random. As she read the familiar words, "How do I love thee? Let me count the ways." She was acutely aware of Levi watching her, his blue eyes reflecting the firelight. When she finished, the cabin seemed even quieter than before, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the persistent howl of the wind outside. "My wife used to read that one," Levi said finally, his voice low. "She had a way of making the words sound like music. She must have been a remarkable woman." "She was." He paused, then added, "Her name was Sarah." It was the first time he had spoken his wife's name, and Cassandra recognized the significance of the moment. This was Levi beginning, in some small way, to share his grief rather than simply stating it as fact. "Tell me about her," Cassandra encouraged gently. "If you want to, that is." To her surprise, Levi did want to. Haltingly at first, then with increasing fluency, he told her about Sarah, how they had met when he was working cattle on her father's ranch, how she had loved wildflowers and could name every star in the sky, how she had insisted on bringing her books with them when they married and moved to Silver Creek where Levi had found work at the sawmill. "She was carrying our first child," he said, staring into the fire. "We were so happy making plans. Then she went into labor early. The doctor, he did what he could, but..." His voice trailed off. "And afterward, you couldn't stay in Silver Creek," Cassandra finished for him. Levi nodded. "Everywhere I looked, I saw what should have been. Our house felt like a tomb, so I packed what I could carry and headed into the mountains. Been here ever since. Alone. Until now," he said, meeting her eyes briefly before looking away. The implication of his words lingered between them as the evening deepened. When it came time to sleep, there was a new awareness, a current of something unspoken as they bid each other good night. The second night in the cabin, Cassandra lay awake long after Levi's breathing had steadied into sleep. She thought about this man who had retreated from the world after suffering such profound loss, who had carved out a solitary existence in this harsh wilderness, and who had nevertheless stopped to help a stranger in a blizzard. There was goodness in him and strength, and a capacity for love that grief had not extinguished but merely buried. And she was honest enough with herself to acknowledge that she was drawn to him in a way that went beyond gratitude. Dawn of the third day brought a change in the weather. The wind had died down, and though snow still fell, it was gentle now, floating lazily from a lightning sky rather than driving horizontally with punishing force. "Storm's breaking," Levi announced as Cassandra joined him at the window. "Should be clear enough to travel by tomorrow." "Oh," she said, surprised by the twinge of disappointment she felt. "That's good news." Levi glanced at her, something unreadable in his expression. "I'll take you to Silver Creek once the trail's passable. You've missed your stagecoach, but you'll still get to town in time to start teaching after the new year." "Yes, of course. Thank you." Cassandra forced a smile, trying to ignore the strange hollowness in her chest. Of course she needed to get to Silver Creek. It was why she had come west, after all. 3 days with Levi Daniels didn't change that. And yet, something had changed. She had changed somehow in this small cabin during the blizzard. The day passed with preparations for their journey. Levi checked his horse's tack, packed provisions, and cleared as much snow as possible from the area around the cabin. Cassandra's clothes, now dry, had been returned to her, and she changed back into them, folding Levi's borrowed shirt with a strange reluctance. That evening, their last in the cabin together, a different kind of tension filled the small space. They spoke little during supper, both aware that their unusual interlude was coming to an end. Finally, as they sat before the fire afterward, Levi broke the silence. "What will you tell them, in Silver Creek, about how you got there?" Cassandra had been wondering the same thing. The truth would cause a scandal that might cost her the teaching position before she even began. "I suppose I'll say that the stagecoach was delayed by the storm," she replied carefully. "It's not exactly a lie." Levi nodded. "Probably for the best. Small towns thrive on gossip." "Would it be so terrible?" Cassandra asked suddenly. "If people knew the truth? That you saved my life?" "It's not my reputation I'm worried about." "Of course not." He lived apart from society, unbound by its conventions. But she would be living in Silver Creek, teaching its children. Her reputation mattered. "I appreciate your concern," she said. "Truly." Levi stood abruptly and moved to the window, staring out at the moonlight reflecting off the snow. "You should get some rest. We'll leave at first light." Cassandra recognized dismissal when she heard it. With a sigh, she rose and went to the bed, but sleep eluded her. She lay awake, listening to Levi moving quietly around the cabin, banking the fire, checking the door latch, finally settling on his pallet. In the stillness of the night, she made a decision. "Levi?" she called softly. Came his immediate response, proving he was as sleepless as she. "Would you consider returning to Silver Creek? Not just to take me there, but to stay." The silence that followed her question was so complete that Cassandra could hear the soft hiss of snowflakes landing on the cabin roof. "Why would I do that?" he finally asked, his voice guarded. Cassandra sat up, gathering her courage. "Because you can't hide from life forever. Because there might be someone worth coming back for." She heard him shift on his pallet, and in the dim light from the banked fire, she could see him sitting up, watching her. "You don't know what you're saying," he said, his voice low. "You're grateful, that's all. And you're a kind woman who sees someone hurting and wants to help. But you don't know me." "I know enough," Cassandra countered. "I know you're honorable and brave. I know you saved my life without hesitation. I know you've suffered a terrible loss, and instead of letting it destroy you, you've found a way to go on living, even if it's been apart from others. And I know that in 3 days, I've come to care for you in a way I never expected." Levi stood and crossed to the bed, kneeling beside it so they were eye to eye. "Cassandra," he said, and the sound of her name on his lips made her heart race. "What you're feeling, it's not real. It's the circumstances. Being trapped here together, depending on each other. Once you're in Silver Creek, starting your new life, you'll see that." "And if I don't?" she challenged. "If what I feel doesn't change?" He shook his head, but she saw the conflict in his eyes. "I can't offer you anything. I'm not the man I was before Sarah died. I'm not asking you to be that man. I'm asking you to consider that there might be a future beyond this cabin, beyond your grief." Levi stood and moved away, creating distance between them. "You should sleep. Tomorrow's a long ride." Cassandra watched him return to his pallet, effectively ending the conversation. But she had seen something in his eyes, a flicker of possibility, of longing that gave her hope. Morning came clear and cold, the storm finally spent. They prepared for the journey in silence, the conversation from the night before hanging between them. Levi was polite but distant as he helped Cassandra onto his horse, then mounted behind her. The ride to Silver Creek would take most of the day, following snow-covered trails through the mountains before descending to the valley where the town lay. As they set out, the sun breaking through the clouds cast long shadows across the pristine white landscape. For the first few hours, they spoke little, each lost in their own thoughts. The steady rhythm of the horse's movement and the occasional call of a bird were the only sounds in the winter stillness. It was near midday when they stopped to rest the horse and eat a simple meal of jerky and hardtack. They sat on a fallen log that Levi had cleared of snow, the winter sun providing little warmth despite its brightness. "It's beautiful," Cassandra said, gazing out at the mountain vista spread before them. "I can understand why you chose to live here." Levi followed her gaze. "It's peaceful, uncomplicated. Is that what you want? An uncomplicated life?" He considered the question. "After Sarah died, it was all I could manage, just surviving from one day to the next. And now," Levi turned to look at her, really look at her, perhaps for the first time. "Now I'm not so sure." The admission hung between them, fragile but significant. "There's nothing wrong with wanting more than survival," Cassandra said softly. "And if I've forgotten how to want more, then perhaps you need someone to remind you." Their eyes held, the moments stretching between them, full of unspoken possibilities. Then Levi stood, breaking the spell. "We should keep moving if we want to reach Silver Creek before dark." They continued their journey, but something had shifted. The silence between them was no longer strained but contemplative, each considering what the future might hold. As they crested a ridge in the early afternoon, Silver Creek came into view in the valley below, a small but thriving settlement with a main street, a church steeple, and scattered houses and businesses spreading outward from the center. Levi reined the horse to a stop, staring down at the town he had left 5 years before. Cassandra felt his tension in the stiffening of his body behind hers. "We can rest here a moment," she suggested gently. He nodded, and they remained atop the ridge, looking down at Silver Creek as the winter sun began its early descent toward the western mountains. "It's smaller than I remembered," Levi said finally. "Is your house still there?" "Sold it before I left. Couldn't bear to stay. Couldn't bear to think of someone else living there either." Cassandra understood. The house had been part of his life with Sarah, part of the future they had planned together. "Where will you go after you leave me in town?" she asked. Levi was quiet for so long that Cassandra thought he might not answer. Then, quietly, he said, "I don't know." It wasn't much, but it was an opening and admission that his path was no longer as clear as it had been before he found her in the blizzard. "You could stay," she suggested, trying to keep her voice casual. "At least for a while. The school board arranged lodgings for me at Mrs. Wilson's boarding house. I'm sure there would be room for you as well." "Cassandra," he began, his tone cautionary. "Just as a friend," she clarified quickly. "Until you decide what you want to do. It would give you time to see if Silver Creek could be home again." Levi was silent, considering. Then, with a small nod, he nudged the horse forward, beginning their descent into the valley. "I'll think about it," he said, and Cassandra felt a surge of hope. They reached Silver Creek as dusk was falling, the windows of the town's buildings glowing with lamplight against the gathering darkness. People moved along the boardwalks, and horses and wagons traversed the main street, the normal evening activities of a small frontier town. Levi guided his horse toward a large, well-maintained house at the edge of town, which Cassandra assumed must be Mrs. Wilson's boarding house. As they approached, a plump, gray-haired woman emerged onto the porch, shading her eyes against the last light of day. "Hello there," she called, then gasped. "Levi Daniels? Is that really you?" Levi dismounted and helped Cassandra down from the horse before turning to the woman. "Evening, Mrs. Wilson." "Yes, it's me." Well, I never. The woman bustled down the steps to meet them. 5 years without a word. And you show up on my doorstep with. She paused, looking questioningly at Cassandra. This is Miss Cassandra Evans, Levi explained. Your new boarder. The schoolteacher. Oh, Mrs. Wilson's eyes widened. But we weren't expecting you until after New Year's. The stagecoach. There was an accident, Cassandra interjected smoothly. The stage broke down in the blizzard. Mr. Daniels happened to be nearby and was kind enough to bring me to town. It wasn't the whole truth, but it wasn't exactly a lie either. Mrs. Wilson seemed to accept the explanation, though her eyes darted curiously between them. Well, you're both welcome here, she said finally. I've got Miss Evans's room ready, and I can prepare another for you, Levi, if you're staying. Levi hesitated, looking at Cassandra. In his eyes, she saw uncertainty, but also something else, a spark of the man he had been before grief had driven him into solitude. I think I will stay, he said slowly. For a while, at least. 3 months later, as spring began to soften the mountain landscape, Levi stood outside the schoolhouse, waiting for Cassandra to finish for the day. They had fallen into a routine over the winter. He had found work at the livery stable while she taught the town's children. And in the evenings, they would often walk together, talking about their days or sometimes just enjoying comfortable silence. Silver Creek had accepted Levi's return with surprise but little fuss. Most people assumed he had simply decided it was time to rejoin civilization, and if they wondered about his relationship with the new schoolteacher, they kept their speculations to themselves. As for Levi and Cassandra, their relationship had developed slowly, cautiously. There had been no grand declarations, no dramatic moments, just a gradual deepening of understanding and affection. Levi had spoken more about Sarah, about his grief, and in doing so had begun to make peace with his loss. Cassandra had shared her own fears and hopes, her desire to build something meaningful in this new place. And somewhere along the way they had fallen in love. The schoolhouse door opened, and Cassandra emerged, smiling when she saw him. As she walked toward him, Levi marveled at how different his life was now from what it had been just a few months ago. The solitary existence that had once seemed his only option now felt like a distant memory. Ready? Cassandra asked, reaching him. Levi nodded, offering his arm. As they walked toward town, he thought about the small box in his pocket, a ring he had purchased from the jeweler that morning. It wasn't anything fancy, just a simple gold band, but he hoped it would be enough. He had plans to ask her this evening, during their usual walk by the creek. He would tell her that she had been right that day on the ridge, that there was more to life than mere survival, that there could be joy and love even after loss. He would tell her that finding her in that blizzard had been the beginning of his own rescue, that she had pulled him back into life just as surely as he had pulled her onto his horse that day. And he hoped, with all his heart, that she would say yes. As if sensing his thoughts, Cassandra squeezed his arm gently and smiled up at him. In her eyes, Levi saw a future he had once thought forever lost, a future bright with promise and possibility. You're quiet today, she observed. Just thinking, he replied, covering her hand with his. About what? Levi smiled, feeling the weight of the ring box in his pocket. About how sometimes the worst blizzard can lead to the clearest day. Cassandra's eyes softened with understanding. Indeed it can, she said, leaning her head against his shoulder as they walked on toward their future together.